Good afternoon on the East Coast, good morning on the West Coast, and hello to SFS alumni from around the world. I'm Joel Hellman. I am Dean of the School of Foreign Service, and I'm here for yet another one of our fast break 30-minute moderated discussions with an SFS faculty member or alum on the topics that are of greatest relevance and interest today. And of course, on everyone's mind is what has been happening over the last several days in Greenland, and we're very excited to have with us Sara Moller from the Security Studies program. I'll tell you a little bit more about her in a minute. But first, some ground rules of the discussion. As I said, this is a 30-minute moderated conversation. I will be monitoring the Q&A function. And during the course of the 30 minutes, if you have a question, please put it into the Q&A function. I won't be picking specific individuals or questioners. I will be moderating those questions and integrating them into our conversation so we have a free-flowing conversation for the entire 30 minutes. And I want to let you know that this is going to be recorded and it is available on the SFS YouTube channel along with all of our other fast breaks. I'm very, very pleased here today to have Sara Moller. Sara Moller is a teaching professor in our Security Studies program, SSP, here at Georgetown. She is an alum of the SSP program at Georgetown as well. In addition, she has been a senior fellow at the defense program at CNAS, as well as a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. She previously taught at Seton Hall. She's published widely. And her area of expertise, of course, extremely topical at the moment, alliances and military adaptation of those alliances couldn't be more relevant for the moment. And in addition, she happens to also be a Dane. She grew up, born and raised in Denmark. And as a result, I'm really hoping that she can give us some insights into the way this is being seen from the Danish perspective. So let's get started. Sara, let me begin by asking you just first to give us a little bit of background on Greenland in the transatlantic security architecture. You know, the underlying issue that President Trump has raised is Greenland's critical importance in the security architecture. What is the security issue as it relates to Greenland? Has that been changing more recently? Tell us what you know about Greenland in that sense.
Of course. Well, first, thank you, Joel, for making time, and thank you to our audience for joining us. I think it's clear to say that the importance of Greenland, both to the wider transatlantic security partnership and, of course, to U.S. security in particular, has fluctuated over time. It's gone from being a very high threat environment during World War II and the Cold War to what was framed as a low tension environment after the Cold War. And into the last decade or so, we've seen a return to this high tension environment. Now, everyone, obviously the American government, but also the Greenlandic and Danish government, recognize that the U.S. has legitimate security concerns and interests in Greenland, and that those interests extend to keeping other countries out. It was actually former Secretary of State George Marshall, way back in 1946, who was the first to declare that it was fundamentally important to the security of the United States to keep an enemy state out of Greenland. And so during the Cold War, there was a lot of focus on the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap because of its significance as a maritime passage and as a choke point for the North Atlantic. Having said all of that, it's equally clear that Greenland's strategic importance has increased today when climate change is making the Northern Sea route more viable. And it's also true that we've seen more interest from other states, though it's been primarily commercial to date and not military. And that interest includes interest from China in the Arctic. So there's no doubt that Greenland's strategic importance and interest has and will continue to grow.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the role of Russia in Greenland? And you mentioned the Chinese on the commercial side. Is there any aspect of Chinese military engagement in and around Greenland?
So, according to Danish intelligence reports that have gone public in other assessments, they have not seen Chinese military interest in Greenland. Elsewhere in the Arctic, yes, without a doubt, but not in Greenland itself. I believe it was the Danish foreign minister in town last week who mentioned that, according to their assessments, it's been almost a decade since there's been a Chinese military vessel off the coast of Greenland. Russia's obviously a different story. Russia is itself a member of the Arctic Council, an Arctic country. Having said that, I noted that one of the reported parts of the so-called framework agreement that may be negotiated that we'll say more on, I'm sure, is no Russian drilling in Greenland. Well, there is no Russian drilling in Greenland, right? The Danes, together with the Greenlandic government in Nuuk and in coordination with Washington, have been very clear-eyed and focused on what commercial investment is happening in Greenland. I think it's also, and I'll just leave it there, worth noting last night's development from the EU emergency meeting of leaders is a new package that is forthcoming on European investment for Greenland.
Well, the last thing I want to ask you about the history of Greenland and the security architecture is at one time you mentioned a little bit about the kind of broad sweep of American engagement there. Tell us the extent at the high point of American engagement in Greenland in terms of the number of bases, troops that we had,
Mhm.
and what was the rationale for the downsizing?
Right, right. Well, so the history of the U.S.-Danish defense cooperation in Greenland actually goes back to World War II, 1941, when the Danish ambassador Henrik Kaufmann negotiated an agreement with the Americans to put forces into Greenland, in large part to keep Germany out, right, to keep it from falling into German hands. This was formalized in the 1951 Greenland Defense Agreement, which established joint responsibilities between Denmark and the United States for defending Greenland, for resisting armed attack. And it gives right to the United States to exercise exclusive jurisdiction over defense areas, basically build, operate harbors, airports, facilities in Greenland, you name it. Now, you're right that there used to be a much more robust U.S. military presence, in Greenland. During the height of the Cold War, the U.S. military had 17 bases there and close to 10,000 troops. Today, we have only one U.S. military base in Greenland. This is the Bidufuk Space Air Force Base, or what used to be known as the Thule Air Force Base. It's based in the north. It has approximately 200 American soldiers. It played host to Vice President J.D. Vance last spring. NORAD operates aircraft from there, and it's obviously very critical for U.S. early missile warning, space surveillance, and satellite control. The Danes have also independently their own military presence there, which I'm happy to say more on. But to answer your question more directly about why we went from a high of 17 military bases to one, there are obviously many reasons, but a big one has to do with the peace dividend after the end of the Cold War, right? This was a cost-saving measure in response to the changing strategic landscape in the North and how the world looked back in the 1990s when Russia wasn't considered a threat. China was going to be integrated into the global economy. And so this part of the world was no longer a priority in the eyes of the U.S. military.
Well, let's now get to the where we are at the moment, the nature of the agreement, where things going to go from here. So we've heard a lot about this framework agreement, or just we've heard the concept of a framework agreement, but we don't know very much about it, to be honest. What details have you been able to glean from the Danish press and the Danish statements from elsewhere about what's in the substance of this agreement? What do we know about it?
Well, I think the substance is changing by the hour. Mette Frederiksen, the Danish prime minister, was in Brussels this morning meeting with the Secretary General Mark Rutte to get a briefing from him. She's presently in Nuuk, meeting with her counterpart, the Greenlandic Prime Minister Jens Frederik Nielsen, to coordinate their diplomatic track. And so I expect we'll certainly know more in the coming hours and days. But I would like to sort of rewind the clock 36 hours to Wednesday evening, if I may, and talk a little bit about the origins of this so-called framework arrangement, because there's been, frankly, a lot of media speculation on both sides of the Atlantic about shared sovereignty arrangements and joint base areas, similar to what the British have in Cyprus. And I can tell you that Trump's comments, as well as Rutte's follow-up, confirmation of those comments following their sidebar in Davos Wednesday evening, took the Danes and the Greenlanders completely by surprise. And that as of midday yesterday, they still had not seen any concrete details. The Danish Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, the Danish Defense Minister, both issue pretty strongly worded statements yesterday saying that they still had not seen anything, that their red line remains the same, that there there will be no shared sovereignty, this is a red line, right? I thought it was also very interesting watching the press conference in Nuuk yesterday with the Greenlandic Prime Minister Nielsen, that when he was asked about the details of this framework, he said directly, I have seen no details. And when he was asked about this idea of shared sovereignty, he said the red line remains the same. No shared sovereignty, territorial integrity is paramount. It's worth noting here, I think, also the Danish Prime Minister's comments yesterday that Mark Rutte, as Secretary General of NATO, has no mandate to negotiate for Denmark or Greenland, which is, of course, true. So there are limits to what Rutte can do to resolve the crisis. And frankly,
can I say this is, tremendously surprising because Rutte, the notion that he's the head of an alliance, not an independent actor on his own. I would have assumed that going into the negotiation, and he would be one of the most effective negotiators with Trump, as we have seen in the past, but he would have gone in armed with some significant conversations prior to that with the Danes, perhaps with the Greenlanders, with other key NATO members, so that he knew what his authorizing space was to negotiate. But are you saying that he just went in there, used his ability to negotiate with Trump, and only then turned to his own membership?
I think his space for operating is to diffuse the crisis, right? Take the tension in the room down. But he cannot negotiate. I think the Danish Prime Minister and her Greenlandic counterpart have said as much in the last 24 hours. He cannot negotiate on behalf of either capital.
So you mentioned what the Prime Minister is sort of saying. They have just established. I'd love to hear more about the Danish response to the claims of an agreement, other than saying this is our red line, sovereignty. Have the Danes been saying anything else? What have you read in the Danish response to where things are at the moment?
Right. Well, as I said, the Danish Prime Minister is currently in meetings with her Greenlandic counterpart. So I think the next couple hours and certainly the next couple of days, we'll have more sense of what their shared joint diplomatic track will be. What I'm hearing and what we're really talking about, I think, is two parallel tracks or agreements. The first is a tripartite working group between Denmark, Greenland, and the United States, which may include the reopening or the renegotiation of the 1951 Defense Agreement, which was last amended in 2004. A second separate track or agreement involves increased NATO engagement within the Arctic, perhaps an Arctic Sentry mission along the lines of the missions the alliance has on its eastern flank. But I think it's important to separate out Greenland from the wider Arctic. I noted with some interest Mette Frederiksen's comments after emerging with her meeting with Mark Rutte this morning. She said, quote, "We agree that NATO should increase its engagement in the Arctic," right? So it's clear that where Denmark stands, there is a role, and where other Arctic NATO members stand, there is a role for NATO to play in what they call the High North, but this is separate from the role that NATO may play in Greenland. And I should note, if I may, just quickly, that historically NATO has not had a strong military presence in Arctic by design, and this was out of deference to U.S. wishes. And I actually think that's one of the reasons why we're likely to see this trend continue of two different tracks, one focused on the wider Arctic region and a trilateral arrangement regarding Greenland.
Well, given what the existing arrangements are now, which you described a little bit earlier, where the U.S. did seem to have sort of tremendous ability to engage in Greenland together with the Danes, what are the gaps? And one questioner has raised this. What are the gaps that could be filled by these new negotiations, or is this just a kind of form of window dressing to diffuse the crisis? Or are there really gaps that negotiations, tripartite negotiation, perhaps dual track negotiations on the Arctic as well as on Greenland could fill that would address security concerns of NATO and security concerns of the US?
Yeah, great question. It's a little of A, a little of B, right? There is a lot of window dressing currently. What the 2004 amendment to the 1951 agreement did was change the language regarding the number of U.S. defense areas in Greenland to recognize that there was only one now, the Pitufik Space Force Base. So I think a likely foreseeable outcome is to change that language to reference other defense areas that the U.S. will be able to operate from in Greenland. But again, this would be going back to an arrangement that has existed since 1951. short of, adding some language into the title so that it becomes known as the Trump-Greenland Agreement, I don't see much else that isn't already contained in that 1951 agreement that could be changed.
What about Trump's stated desire to incorporate the Arctic and Greenland into the Iron Dome? And this is one of the questions that come up as well.
Mhm.
Are there things that would be required for the Iron Dome plan to come to fruition that would require something different in the arrangements
Mhm.
that they have with Greenland and in the Arctic?
So we're obviously very early in the stages of the Golden Dome planning, but my understanding is no, not necessarily, right? There would be investment required, but from a security standpoint, right, the Americans have the access that they require. And it's also, I think, worth pointing out that Greenland is already covered by NORAD. In fact, there are NORAD flights there right now as we speak, participating in an exercise. So again, I think this is beyond a question of just purely strategic interests, and there is an element well, frankly, as the president told David Sanger of the New York Times, that this is psychologically necessary for him.
What about commercially necessary? The access to resources, rare earths, mineral finds with the changing climate. We haven't talked a lot, if we think about what happened in Venezuela, how quickly the conversation moved away from drugs into oil resources. What do we know about the resource issues that
Mhm.
are bound up in this current set of issues?
Well, there are clearly substantial critical minerals in Greenland, but it's also a very inhospitable and expensive environment to operate in. So we haven't seen a lot of American interest. The Danish foreign minister, when he was in town last week, mentioned that in recent years, when they have tendered bids for investment, American firms have not made any offers. So I think the bottom line is, if this were about critical minerals, there are other places. And I think the president also referenced that in his Davos comments this week, that this was not about critical minerals.
Well, what would U.S. gain from ownership from this? I mean, have a longer time frame and understand the significant relationship between Greenland and Denmark. From what I understand, there's a very strong subsidization of Denmark from Denmark to Greenland. Again, trying to understand the motivations for acquiring Greenland. We've got lots of questions about why does the U.S. want to acquire this, given what you've already told us already. But to what extent is and has Denmark been subsidizing Greenland? How much does that cost?
Mhm.
And would the United States play a bigger role? Obviously, not necessarily in acquiring it, which I don't think is moving further,
Mhm.
but even in the kind of engagement that it's talking
Mhm.
about now in subsidizing, financing, or
Mhm.
otherwise sort of supporting Greenland.
Yes. So at present, the Danish government contributes around 500, $600 million a year to subsidize Greenland, to support Greenland, right? Greenland is on a path to independence. It has, I think, a status that many listeners and viewers familiar with the path that Canada, New Zealand, and Australia took in the 20th century in acquiring independence from Britain. Similar to that. So, following the 2004, 2009 self-government agreement between Denmark and Greenland, they now have more responsibility for critical minerals and other domestic issues, but Denmark still has responsibility. There's a clear division of duties and lines, if you will. Denmark still has responsibility for both foreign security defense policy, but also economic matters.
Okay,
And I
well,
should
let's go. No, please go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, I was going to say, separate from the constitutional and legal ties, I think it's also worth noting here the people-to-people ties between Greenland and Denmark are quite strong. Obviously, with any colonizer-colonized relationship, there's a history that needs to be overcome. Denmark has had problematic policies towards Greenland in the past that have real social, tangible legacies. But it's worth noting that about 1 in 10 people who live in Greenland today are from Denmark, and about 17,000 indigenous Greenlanders live in Denmark right now, which is about a third of the total Greenlandic population.
Well, look, I want to talk about where things go from here and how this has impacted NATO and the alliance. But first, this issue has sort of dropped out of the front page of the news. And to some extent, as the market sort of suggested, there's almost a feel as, oh, well, this crisis is past. To what extent has this crisis passed? Given what you're saying, which is that the Danish side is only just now learning of the nature of the agreement, to what extent are we likely to be back to the drawing board again of Trump making threats, the Danes and the Greenlanders not agreeing to these threats, and back again in the tit for tat kind of approach that Trump seems to exemplify in his relationship with those he disagrees with?
I think, unfortunately, there's a real risk of that, right? The crisis has lessened for the moment. We're certainly ending the week in a better place than we started. So, despite tensions having eased, the underlying issue, however, remains, right? And so, to my mind, we're really back to the place we were last week when the Danish foreign minister, Lars Løkke Rasmussen, and his Greenlandic counterpart, Vivian Motzfeldt, met with Secretary Rubio and Vice President Vance. And following that meeting, which the Danes had been requesting for 13 months, following that meeting, it emerged that there would be a working group formed to discuss ways forward to resolve the outstanding issues, what the Danish delegation has continued to characterize as a fundamental disagreement with the Americans over the future status of Greenland. Now, this announcement of the formation of the working group last week was followed only hours later by a statement by the White House press secretary, Carolyn Levitt, announcing that the working group would be discussing Greenland's acquisition, which led to a very strong rebuke from Greenland and Denmark saying, no, that was not actually the agreement. So the situation, to my mind, is still very grave, not just for Denmark and Greenland, but for NATO as an alliance. I would say we're not out of the danger zone because that fundamental disagreement still exists.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the implications for NATO. One does get the feeling that despite, or not, building on, I should say, the now year-long set of tensions that Trump has integrated into the engagement with our closest allies in NATO. There does seem to be the feeling, or perhaps there was a feeling last week, that this was a last straw. Carney's speech, obviously, at Davos is being seen. The use of the word rupture has really kind of changed the nature of the dialogue. Is this is this a last straw? Not necessarily for NATO and its survivability as alliance, although maybe that does play in. But do you really think this is going to mark a decisive change in the European posture to the US within the NATO alliance?
Yes, and that's something I wouldn't have said before this week, frankly. I'm reminded of the words of someone that you and I, Joel, read in graduate school, the work of French-American political scientist Stanley Hoffman, who said that the Atlantic Alliance is a history of the Atlantic Alliance is a history of crises, right? The idea that the alliance is perpetually in crisis. And there's some truth to that, but nothing comes close to this, not the fallout over Iraq in 2003, not even Suez in 56, which saw the U.S. break from the Brits and the French over its invasion of Egypt, not the Turkish Greek crisis in 74. You had at the start of this week a member of the alliance, and not just any member, but the leader of the alliance, threatening the territory of a NATO ally at the same time while the Kremlin was issuing press statements recognizing Greenland as a Danish territory. I had dinner this week with a number of individuals who work at NATO at the military headquarters in Mons, Shape, and I asked them, what's the mood like there this day? And they said, everything was okay until this week, right? So I think there is some truth to the words of Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney that there is now a rupture and that it is complete, right? There's a deep wound to the alliance. I noted with interest polling out of the UK this week saying that if the US moves ahead with annexing Greenland or otherwise trying to take Greenland, that a plurality of British citizens would now support expelling American forces from the UK, right? Having said all of that, I also think it's clear that within the alliance there, and this predates the current crisis, there is some frustration with the Secretary General, with Mark Rutte, I've heard from several ambassadors, none of which are Danish, that they're unhappy with him as a leader because he's been seen as very subservient and deferential to Trump. So while it's certainly the case that Greenland makes NATO more vulnerable to Russia and China, I think the rift within the alliance is also very real. And for about a decade or so, the main division or fault line within the alliance was over the nature of the Russian threat. And I think after this week, the main division or fault line in the alliance is over how to manage the United States. So if nothing else, I think what this week has done is accelerate efforts already underway to decouple Europe from its dependency on U.S. security.
Well, can you give us some scenarios of how the rupture plays out?
Mm.
Because there's a scenario that says, NATO survives, but
Mhm.
as you were just sort of suggesting, European security arrangements begin to shift with less dependence on the United States, even more efforts to build up a strong
Mhm.
European security architecture without the United States. That's one scenario. It's a shifting
Mhm.
actions of the members within the overall NATO umbrella. But are there other scenarios of rupture that we should look about that where America is so isolated, where NATO doesn't survive this? I'm just curious as what you think of the different options that come
Mhm.
out of this rupture.
I think the most likely is still the first scenario described, the shifting actions within the membership. We're already seeing this. There are plans afoot to change the division of duties within the alliance with respect to who gets which command. Now, not SACEUR, right, which by president has always been occupied by an American, but further down the operational chain in the NATO military command structure, there is an effort underway to replace American commanders with European commanders. And this is an effort being led by Washington, but supported by Europeans and Canadians. I think the key thing to keep in mind here when we talk about the future NATO are the timelines, right? Europe, by their own admission, has underinvested in their security for many decades. And so these developments and any changes to NATO are not going to happen internally, and we're not going to see a shift on a dime. Also, partly because of the defense industrial base issues that have been raised and the long procurement schedules and the difficulties that several European countries are having now with recruitment and retention as they try to rebuild their armed forces after decades of underinvestment. So we're seeing gradual shifts within the alliance, but I think the direction is clear now.
And if the crisis is not over, and if we return because the Danes and the Greenlanders don't agree to this framework that Rutte has negotiated without their consent or engagement, and Trump returns again to the same posture that he had last in the early part of the week, threats, economic sanctions and tariffs against European actors, continued threats of military or other means. He likes to keep them vague. What do you think the likely outcomes are of a return to that posture if it does happen?
It's not unlikely, let me put it this way. My concern at the moment is if we're back in that world where we were earlier, there could be less appetite on the part of other European NATO allies to respond the way they did this week. At the council meeting last week, excuse me, last evening, it's been a long week, um, Ursula von der Leyen, was sort of doing a victory lap, one could say, in praising European unity and the fact that they stood firm, right? My concern is that for some European NATO members, this is now water on the bridge and we can move forward. And I don't think Denmark and Greenland see it that way, precisely for the reasons we've been discussing, that there is a risk of return. And so you could see next time around more fractured European reaction, which would also be detrimental to NATO and the transatlantic relationship.
That's interesting. So you think that if we return back to a threatening posture, that that unlike what we saw earlier in the week, where the European nations were saying that this was a breach, a true breach of trust, and that it was encouraging a greater European unity in support
Mhm.
of the Danes and in support of the sovereignty
Mhm.
of a NATO member. You think that perhaps this could further fragment the Europeans? And
Yes,
last
because
question is, could it have any impact on how they deal with Ukraine
yes. Okay.
from
So I'll be quick. Yes to your first point, because there is a division within Europe over how to manage. And so we have, seen statements from Italy's Meloni and Poland's Donald Tusk sort of, saying this is now in the past. Let's go back to standard operating procedures. And there's a different camp within Europe that thinks this is not possible, frankly. Regarding Ukraine, I think as Zelensky referenced in his own comments at Davos this week, right? This has taken the focus away from Ukraine, though my understanding is there's also breaking news on that part today after the meetings in Moscow. And so, I look forward to tuning in next week if there is a fast break development. But there's no doubt that Ukraine and Greenland together is a lot for the alliance to manage at the moment when it comes to also managing its relationship with the United States.
Well, we need to leave it at there. As you say, there's likely to be more fast breaks on this topic going forward. But this was extremely informative on multiple levels. So I really want to thank you, Sara, and I want to thank our audience and let them know that, look, our role here at SFS is to bring the information, bring the expertise of our faculty, of our alumni community to our community so they can react, they can engage as a broader SFS alums around the world through these extraordinary, indeed momentous events and changes. I want to thank all of you for tuning in. We're going to be back again, I'm sure, very, very soon as we continue the Fast Break series with these extraordinary events around the world. And again, do look at our YouTube channel where all the fast breaks are there and available for view. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Sara, and I wish you all the best for the weekend. Take care. Stay away from the snow, I hope, for those on the East and Atlantic coast. All the best. Bye-bye.